Back to the Dean Obeidallah show. Right now, very happy to have U.S. Senator Chris Murphy on, a Democrat representing Connecticut, a leading voice to save lives from gun violence, serves on Senate Appropriations Committee, Foreign Relations Committee, and more. Senator Murphy, thanks for being on. It's great to have you.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for having me.
Sure. So earlier this month, and I saw you noted the DOJ finalized a new rule to expand background checks that was arises out of the law that you champion, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. Can you share a little how this will expand background checks, how this potentially can save lives?
Sure. Listen, as everybody knows, for 30 years, we did nothing on guns at the federal level, and gun violence rates were spiking. Finally, in 2022, after the tragic shootings in Buffalo and Uvalde, I was able to muster just enough votes in the House and the Senate in order to pass the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. That's the sort of most significant anti-gun violence bill in 30 years. And there was a lot of attention in the bill on support for red flag laws, closing the boyfriend loophole, new background checks on young buyers who are trying to get assault weapons. But there was not as much attention on a very small change in the bill that updated the definition of a licensed gun dealer. What has happened over the last 30 years is that gun sales in this country have sort of moved from bricks and mortar stores, gun stores, to online sales and gun shows. There are tons of part-time sellers. They're for-profit sellers. They're people who are making a lot of money, but they're part-time sellers that are offering guns online and at these gun shows. And the law previously was a little oblique as to whether those people had to get licensed and do background checks. And so what happened was, maybe half of our gun sales all of a sudden were happening without background checks because they were being done in these informal settings by part-time sellers. What the bill did was to update the definition to say it doesn't matter if you are doing this for a living or you're doing this on the side. If you are making a profit, if you are regularly selling guns in any commercial forum, you have to get licensed and do background checks. So that was in the bill. The president had to sort of enforce it, create a rule so that everybody knew who had to be licensed and who didn't. A week ago, he announced that rule, and now every commercial seller in this country of guns has to do background checks. We think that will mean an additional 20 to 25,000 sellers of guns who weren't doing background checks will now be forced to do background checks. That is a huge deal because what we know is that when you do background checks, we save lives.
And that's a great point, because I know in the past the effort to close what is known as the gun show loophole struggled and try to find support for it. In this case, a little way it chips out a little bit. What I know that the issue with gun violence is something you've worked on now for years. What more would you like to see? Because I know it's challenging to get it through, but say President Biden hopefully gets reelected, Democrats keep the Senate, get the House. And is there something you would like to see, or something like if there were a couple of things that really could make a bigger impact on lowering the number of people who die each day, either from suicide or from murder involving a gun?
Well, the only way that you can continue to make progress is for people to believe that when you change the laws, you make a difference.
Right.
The gun lobby wants you to believe that none of this matters. The guns don't matter. It's people who pull the trigger. We need more guns to stop gun crime.
Right.
All that's BS. But the good news, the great news, is that since we passed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act in 2022, gun violence rates in this country have plummeted. From 2022 to 2023, we saw a 12% reduction in urban gun crime. That is the biggest one-year drop in the history of the country. And the numbers from 2023 to 2024 are continuing to come down. So we just have to celebrate the fact that when we changed the laws, we saved lives. But you're right, we're not done. We've got to pass universal background checks. That means that every single commercial sale has a background check applied to it. We made the biggest down payment ever towards that goal in the 2022 bill, but we need to get all the way there. And then we need to ban assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. These mass killers rely on these powerful assault weapons in order to kill 30, 40 people in a handful of minutes. And we would just dramatically lower the number of mass shootings in this country if we got rid of those guns. So those are the two big pieces of unfinished business. And I really do believe we'll get both of those done, in the coming years.
And I hope so. A big component of the loss of life in America, about 2/3 of daily loss of life involving guns, or suicide. Is there any prospect on the federal level to address it that can change a little? I mean, I read some studies where there was 3-day waiting periods that lowered the number of suicides by gun. And if someone tries to use a gun for suicide, it's sadly, tragically so successful at it. But if they got the help, perhaps something else can change.
Right. What you need to know about suicide is this: the average suicidal thought um, disappears in an instant. It normally lasts on average 20 minutes.
Okay.
So the question is, for most people, do you have access to lethal means during that 20-minute period of time? And for suicides, the lethal means is almost always a gun
Yeah.
in America. Other people do commit suicide by other means, but that is the primary way that lethal suicides occur. So one of the things we can do is just have guns locked up,
Hmm.
right? Because if guns are locked, then the person who's not the owner can't get their hands on them. And often it's the person in the house who's not the owner of the gun who uses it to kill themselves. So that's one of the things that we can move forward on. In Connecticut, for instance, we've passed a law that actually has criminal penalties if you are an adult and you have children in the house and you don't lock up your guns. We'd like to see that on a federal level. That's something that's not as super partisan, just responsible gun
Sure.
ownership. That would do a lot to reduce both suicides and accidental shootings.
No, I so appreciate it because it's not often talked about, and it's such a big component of the loss of life in our nation each day involving guns. I'm chatting with U.S. Senator Chris Murphy. To shift gears to foreign policy, with Gaza, you've been outspoken about the need for humanitarian assistance to people in Gaza. Obviously, release the hostages, of course, but that since November, you've been talking about Netanyahu trying to be more aware of the civilians there. And first, I can't say how much I appreciate being a Palestinian heritage myself. My family's in the West Bank, but I so appreciate that on a human level. But in the bigger global picture, where are we now? I mean, there's almost no reports of any kind of ceasefire talks. I saw that just earlier today. The Israeli military has dropped bombs and targeted more places in Gaza, especially in the north. And while the loss of life is less on a daily basis, it's still heartbreaking. We see 50, 25 children killed in a week, 100 in a week. It's still a heartbreaking situation, just not as bad.
The bottom line here is that I support uh, Israel's goal of destroying Hamas's ability to ever do this again. I support Israel's goal of destroying the ability of any terrorist group to launch the kind of horrifying attack we saw on October 7th. What I worry is that this is doing, in the long run, very little to effectuate that goal. In fact, the high level of civilian loss of life is going to be bulletin board recruiting material for terrorists and for the next generation of Hamas leadership for the next 30 years. So to me, I, from the start, never understood the way in which this Israeli campaign is serving their stated goal of making their country safer. I mean, we learned that lesson in Afghanistan. We were so cavalier about the loss of civilian life in Afghanistan that we ended up stoking the fires of Taliban recruitment. 20 years later, we had to withdraw because we had made the Taliban stronger, not weaker, during that military occupation. So, yes, I've been pretty strong in the words I've used here. I do believe that Israel needs to suspend military operations. I think we have to make the humanitarian response a priority. I think the Biden administration has to draw a hard line on the invasion of Rafah. There is no way to be able to evacuate the number of people who are there and to protect human life. Um, and so I'm rooting for a ceasefire. I want the hostages out, but I think right now the priority has to be humanitarian relief, and that means a temporary cessation of the Israeli military campaign.
I recently spoke to Congressman Jason Crow, who was an Army Ranger, who voiced a similar, said, this is not strategically how you defeat terrorism. This is how you give birth to an even larger terrorist movement. It makes no sense. It's also morally wrong. We've got into that. So, last thing I want to touch on, you wrote an op ed about immigrants and American anxiety. You took a trip to Boone, North Carolina, a very red district, but it was very eye opening that what you learned and what you shared, you wrote it for the Bulwark. Can you share a little bit about what you heard from people and how they felt essentially abandoned?
Yeah, I spent most of my winter working on a big bipartisan immigration reform
Mhm.
proposal with Kirsten Sinema and Republican Senator James Lankford. We actually got that deal done, and
Yep.
then Republicans turned on it because they don't actually want to fix the border. But I do think it's really important for us to understand why immigration right now is ranked as one of the top two or three issues for Americans, both on the left and the right. I mean, there is a feeling out there in the country that a lot of folks have been waiting in line for the American dream for a very, very long time. They feel like they have played by the rules and not gotten anywhere. And so they do sort of see 10,000 Americans coming, 10,000 immigrants coming into the country on a daily basis, in their minds, cutting the line, not playing by the rules. And they get very upset and anxious about that. And I think that Trump's anti immigrant siren song is a completely irresponsible way to address that anxiety that Americans feel about the line that they've been waiting in. But Democrats have to recognize that folks are not looking for changes around the margins. They are looking for a wholesale revamp of our economic system so that if they put in the work, they get the outcome, which is a better life and a better life for their kids. And so, that's why a lot of us are, cheering on these massive new organizing drives for unions that are empowering millions of workers. That's why we think you shouldn't increase the minimum wage by $2, but by $10. I mean, you've got to make some real big jumps forward when it comes to people's ability to achieve the American dream, or they're going to listen to demagogues like Trump who tell you that the problem is immigrants, that the problem is gay kids, right? That message resonates in the absence of a transformational economic narrative from the other side.
I so appreciate that the article that in the way you talked about it in a constructive way, not that dismissive way. And to the point you just made, I just interviewed recently Professor Joseph Stiglitz, who was in the Clinton administration, but he's a new book out about freedom. But in the book, he talks about demagogues finding fertile way to grow their message in a time of not only economic inequality that we have that's getting worse in our country, but a loss of hope. And that this is really important. So we can't be this. We can't. There are certain people who are bigots. I'm not giving them any quarter, but I'm saying there's other Americans who are really concerned about things. And you're absolutely right. It's the fertile ground for the demagogue coming up. And the last question thing: any hope for some kind of border security? I know immigration reform and a path to some kind of citizenship is so important for dreamers as well. But any hope of any kind of not before Election Day?
Yeah, well, I'll make one last point on that issue of trying to find hope and trying to diagnose that anxiety that's happening in the country. Spencer Cox, who's the Republican governor of Utah, and I just today launched a new initiative, a national conversation, trying to get Republicans and Democrats in the same room, responsible Republicans and Democrats in the same room, to try to understand the source of American unhappiness, unease, anxiety, and try to find if there are some places that the two parties can work on outside of these issues that tend to pit us against each other to try to deliver more meaning and purpose and connectedness to people's lives. But the short answer to your question about immigration is no. The Republicans have made it very clear they do not want to solve the border. They do not want to solve the problem of immigration. They see it as a necessary political cudgel in these elections because the Republicans don't really stand for anything any longer. So they have to be against things. And one of the things they're going to be against is immigrants fleeing torture and terror and coming to this country. So I will be ready anytime Republicans are sincere, but we cut a really tough border security deal. Republicans asked for it, and then they ran for the hills because they couldn't sort of envision a world in which they couldn't complain about the border. Republicans couldn't live in a world in which the border was under control.
And they wanted to run it. And if you could do anything to make me happy, is try to get the New York Giants better. So if you and the governor from Utah could talk about helping the New York Giants here, because we're in the tri-state area.
Let's just hope that maybe Jaden Daniels falls. Maybe we get him at 5. I want a quarterback. I'm not sold on Daniel Jones.
Well, you have UConn
like a very
for
nice
basketball.
person, but I do not think he's the quarterback of the future.
You have UConn. You just want to back to back.
I know. I'm not complaining.
I know you've got a great thing. I'm in New York. I'm in
complaining.
Jersey. We don't have any of it. Well, Senator Murphy, thanks so much for being on. I appreciate it. I really appreciate the opportunity to have a chat with you, and I hope we'll get to chat with you in the future.
Thanks, Dean.